Welcome back to the deep dive. I want to start today by asking you to um, visualize a really specific person. I want you to picture the absolute ultimate CEO.
Oh, this is a fun exercise.
Right. So think of the titan of industry, the person you would see on the cover of Fortune magazine back in, say, 1995 or maybe 2005. What do they look like to you? Like, how do they actually act in a room?
Yeah, I know exactly the archetype you're conjuring up here. It is the classic imperial CEO. It is Jack Welch at GE. It is Lee Iacocca.
Exactly.
It is the person standing at the absolute head of the boardroom table, probably barking orders, and definitely positioned as the smartest person in the room. They radiate this kind of aura of invincibility.
They know everything.
They know everything, they control everything, and fundamentally they are utterly alone at the top of the pyramid.
That is the exact image. That is the archetype we have all been sold for decades. But today, we're actually going to completely dismantle that image.
We have to because it just doesn't work anymore.
Exactly. We are taking a massive stack of research today that suggests that the imperial CEO is not just out of style-like, is not just a fashion trend that passed. They are actually a massive corporate liability.
They are essentially extinct.
Right. And if you try to lead that way today, you will not just fail, you will actively crash the company into the ground.
The environment has simply become too hostile for that specific species of leader to survive.
So to help us navigate this completely new landscape, we are diving deep into a book called The Journey of Leadership. It is written by four very senior partners at McKinsey: Dana Mao, Hans-Werner Kaas, Kurt Struvink, and Ramesh Srinivasan.
And I know what you're probably thinking right now.
You are thinking McKinsey partners.
Yeah, you are thinking, is this just going to be 400 pages of sterile charts and graphs and corporate acronyms that nobody actually uses in real life?
Which is a completely fair skepticism to have.
It is. Usually high-level consulting books are incredibly dry. They talk endlessly about operational synergies and strategic market positioning and supply chain efficiency.
But this one is different.
It is remarkably different. It is surprisingly, well, human. It is messy. It actually deals with psychology, with childhood trauma, with deep-seated fear, and with massive egos.
And that tone, that kind of messy human reality, comes directly from where the data was actually sourced. This is not just academic theory cooked up in a business school. This is drawn from something called the Maor Forum.
Yes, the Maor Forum.
Can you just set the scene for us? What actually is the Maor Forum?
It is honestly one of the most exclusive and frankly secretive leadership development programs in the entire world. McKinsey runs it.
Paint the picture for us.
Picture a highly secluded retreat somewhere in Northern California. It is beautiful scenery, it is incredibly quiet, and it is intensely private. They bring in a very small, very curated group of the world's most powerful CEOs.
We are talking about the heavy hitters.
We are talking about people who literally run national economies, people whose daily decisions move global markets, and they get them all into this beautiful room and they lock the door.
And the fundamental rule of the room is Chatham House rules, right?
Strict, unbreakable confidentiality. Absolutely nothing that is said in that room ever leaves that room. And because of that absolute seal of secrecy, the entire dynamic of these titans completely shifts.
Because normally they are always on stage.
Right. If you meet these exact same people at Davos or on an earnings call, they are posturing, they are selling their stock, they are projecting that imperial CEO invincibility.
But not in Northern California.
In the Maor Forum, the armor finally comes off. They actually break down. Some of them cry. They openly admit that they are terrified. They confess to their peers that they have absolutely no idea how to handle the sheer chaos of the modern business world.
I think that is just such a compelling hook for this deep dive. The idea that the literal masters of the universe are sitting in a room in California, looking at each other and admitting they are just as lost as the rest of us.
It completely validates the central thesis of the entire book. The world has just become far too complex, far too fast for any one single person to have all the answers in their head.
We are dealing with too much all at once.
Think about it. We are navigating massive AI disruption, unprecedented geopolitical fragmentation, supply chains that collapse overnight, the entirely new psychology of hybrid workforces, and a basic social contract between employer and employee that is completely rewriting itself in real time.
It is overwhelming.
It is. The old imperial CEO who stands alone at the top and just barks orders simply cannot process that volume of data. They literally become a bottleneck that chokes their own company.
So if that old commander-in-chief model is truly dead and buried, what actually replaces it? The authors introduced this concept. They called it inside-out leadership.
Yeah, inside-out leadership.
What does that actually mean in practice?
I will admit it sounds a little bit like a therapy slogan at first glance.
It does sound a bit soft.
But the underlying logic is incredibly rigorous. The core argument here is that you simply cannot effectively lead an organization. You cannot move the stock price. You cannot execute a global strategy. You cannot inspire thousands of troops until you first master your own internal psychology.
You have to fix the engine before you drive the car.
Exactly. You have to lead yourself before you have any right to lead others. If your internal operating system is buggy, meaning if you are subconsciously driven by insecurity or by an unmanaged ego or by a fear of failure, you will inevitably project all of those bugs onto your organization.
You infect the company with your own neuroses.
You do. So the structure of our deep dive today is going to mirror that exact transformational journey. We have a massive amount of ground to cover because the book breaks this down into two distinct, huge transformations.
Right, part 1 and part 2.
Part 1 is the inner journey. That is the hard work of rewiring your own brain, identifying your psychological habits, and changing your mindsets.
And then we turn outward.
Right. Part 2 is the outer journey. That is where we look at how you take that newly stabilized, human-centric self and apply it to fundamentally change the culture and operations of a massive organization.
You know, I really want to emphasize this to you as you are listening right now. This is not just advice for people who already have CEO on their business cards.
Absolutely not.
If you are managing a small team, if you are running a household, or if you are just trying to navigate the politics of your own career, these psychological shifts are completely universal. You need this toolkit.
The psychology of human influence does not change based on your tax bracket.
So let us jump right into part 1, the inner journey. It starts with you. The authors identify 6 specific elements or habits you need to master here. And the very first one is humility.
Humility.
And I have to be completely honest here. When I look at the headlines on CNBC or Bloomberg, humble is absolutely not the first adjective I would use to describe the heavy hitters in the modern business world.
I completely understand why you say that, but that is largely because as a culture, we very often mistake arrogant bluster for actual competence. But the authors dig into this and they identify a very specific, very destructive psychological trap that high performers constantly fall into.
They call it going one up.
Going one up. It is a brilliant way to frame it.
Walk us through the actual mechanics of that. What does going one up look like in the wild?
At its core, it is a psychological defense mechanism. It almost always happens when a leader feels fundamentally threatened or insecure in a given moment.
Like when they are challenged.
Right. Maybe they are sitting in a tense meeting and a junior analyst openly challenges their data. Or maybe they are brand new to a senior role and they are privately suffering from massive imposter syndrome. The human brain automatically interprets that social ambiguity as a literal survival threat.
The amygdala kicks in.
Exactly. The primal brain takes over. So instinctively, in order to make themselves feel safe and protected, they try to make themselves appear much bigger than everyone else.
How does that actually manifest in a boardroom, though?
It takes a lot of subtle and not so subtle forms. They might constantly interrupt people. They might suddenly start using incredibly complex, impenetrable jargon just to purposefully confuse the room and sound smarter.
We have all seen that happen.
They might actively withhold crucial information just to maintain leverage over a team. Or they simply assert an absolute authority that they do not actually have. They go one up to artificially reestablish dominance. The underlying message is always, I am the boss, therefore, by definition, I am right.
So it is essentially the classic, I am the smartest person in the room syndrome. But what you are pointing out is that it is actually born entirely out of profound insecurity, not out of superior intelligence.
Precisely. It is a fear reaction, pure and simple. And the problem is it completely kills any chance of collaboration because everyone else in the room immediately shuts down.
Because why bother?
Right. Why would anyone offer a creative idea or flag a potential risk if they know the boss is just going to aggressively crush them just to make themselves feel a little bit taller?
To illustrate how to counter this, the book provides this really fascinating, almost cinematic case study of an Asian tech giant CEO. Now, we obviously cannot use his real name because of the Bauer Forum privacy rules, but the power dynamic here is straight out of a Shakespearean drama.
It really is incredible. So picture this. This executive finally gets the top job. He is officially the CEO of a massive, globally significant tech conglomerate.
The dream job.
But there is a massive catch. The current chairman of the board is actually the former CEO, and this chairman is not just any executive. He is a literal legend in the industry. He built the company from scratch. He ran it single-handedly for 20
And
years.
he clearly did not really want to let go of the steering wheel.
Not at all. It is the classic shadow CEO nightmare scenario.
That sounds absolutely suffocating.
It was. The chairman continued to rule with an iron fist. He openly questioned almost every single strategic decision the new CEO tried to make. He actively blocked the new CEO's cultural initiatives.
So the new guy is CEO in name only.
He felt completely castrated professionally. He couldn't move a muscle without hitting a wall. So he ends up at the Maor Forum, and he is just furious. He is venting to the group. He basically tells them, I need to fight this guy. I need to take him on directly and show everyone that I am the actual boss now.
He wanted to go one up on the legendary chairman.
Exactly. His ego was demanding that he enter a bloody head-to-head power struggle to prove his worth. But his peers in the forum, other CEOs who have survived these wars, they physically stopped him.
What did they tell him?
They looked at the reality of the situation and they said, you absolutely cannot win a direct war with this man. He is a founder. He is a legend. You are just the new guy. If you try to outmuscle him in the boardroom, he will crush you and you will be fired.
So what is the alternative? Just submit.
No, they told him he needed to do the radical opposite of fighting. They told him he needed to go one down.
Go one down. That honestly just sounds like total surrender.
It absolutely feels like a surrender to your own ego, which is why it is so hard to do. But strategically, it is actually a brilliant flanking maneuver.
How does that work?
Well, the forum group sat down and helped him map out the actual power dynamics of the entire company. And they realized something critical. There was a massive Indonesian investment fund that held something like 30% of the company's stock.
Okay, so they hold the real purse strings.
Right. And the chairman actually listened to these specific investors. He deeply respected their opinions. But the new CEO, he had absolutely zero existing relationship with them. They didn't know him at all.
So the truly humble move in this scenario wasn't to fight the chairman directly. The humble move was to admit that he lacked the power he needed and to seek help from the outside.
Correct. He had to swallow his pride and admit he couldn't do it alone. He needed a coalition. So he got on a plane and he flew all the way to Indonesia.
And what did he do when he got there?
He did not go there to brag about his new title. He went there to report to them. He sat down in a room with these powerful investors, and he focused entirely on building a real relationship.
He went one down.
He went one down. He listened to all of their concerns about the market. He asked for their advice. And only then did he quietly share his own vision for the future of the company. He completely humbled himself to their authority as owners.
And what was the actual payoff for that level of humility?
It took some time, but eventually those Indonesian investors went back to the chairman on their own, and they basically said to him, hey, we have been talking to this new guy. We really like him. He actually listens to us. He is incredibly sharp. You really should back off a bit and let him lead the company.
That is just brilliant. He never actually fought the chairman. He completely outmaneuvered him by building a coalition based on listening.
That is the ultimate paradox of humility and leadership. By willingly admitting that he was not the most powerful person in the room, by actively seeking help and guidance, he organically became the most powerful person in the room.
This links so perfectly to the actual skill of listening, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because you cannot possibly build that kind of deep trust in Indonesia if you're sitting there just waiting for your turn to speak.
Right. The authors draw a very hard line between passive listening and attuned listening.
What is the difference?
Passive listening is what most of us do every day. It is just nodding your head and making eye contact while you mentally rehearse your counter-argument. You aren't actually absorbing anything.
You were just waiting to go one up.
Exactly. Attuned listening, on the other hand, involves what they call the yin and yang of listening. It is openness, which is clearing your mind of assumptions, and tuning in, which is actively searching for the emotional subtext behind the words.
There was that wild example in the book of the CEO who literally goes scuba diving to get better at this.
Yes. It sounds extreme, but the underlying psychology is sound. He deliberately schedules time to go deep-sea scuba diving, or he takes these very long, silent nature walks, specifically to train his own brain to be quiet.
To turn off the internal monologue.
Think about the modern executive. Their internal monologue is just screaming at them at 24/7. Check your email. The stock price just dipped. You need to answer that Slack message. If you cannot intentionally quiet that internal noise, you cannot possibly hear the subtle, quiet signals that your team is trying to send you.
And in a crisis, those signals matter.
In a major crisis, the real truth is almost always whispered by someone lower down the chain. It is rarely shouted. If your mind is noisy, you will miss it.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So let us pivot now to the second element of the inner journey, confidence. Now, I feel like you were throwing me a bit of a curveball here.
Well, so.
Well, we just spent the last 10 minutes talking about the absolute necessity of being humble, of going one down, of killing the ego, and now you are telling me I need to be highly confident. Isn't confidence exactly how we backslide into the imperial CEO mindset?
It is a really vital distinction to make. The imperial CEO operates on arrogance. Arrogance is incredibly loud. It constantly demands attention and validation from everyone else. The modern leader, however, needs what the authors specifically call grounded confidence.
Grounded confidence, how's that different?
Grounded confidence is quiet. It is the deeply internalized, unshakable belief that I belong here. I do not need to prove my worth to you because I already know my worth.
I belong here.
It is essential because, contrary to popular belief, imposter syndrome at the C-level is absolutely rampant.
I think most people listening probably assume that once you get the corner office, once you get the private jet, all of that self-doubt just magically vanishes.
I think we all want to assume that. We figure if someone is making $10 million a year to run a bank, they probably feel pretty secure in their abilities.
Right.
But the reality is actually the exact opposite. The higher you climb, the hotter the spotlight gets, the financial stakes become astronomical, and the critics in the media become much, much louder.
So the imposter syndrome scales with the job.
It absolutely does. The book shares a really revealing case study of a young European CEO. He inherited a massive, multi-generational family business. We are talking billions in revenue.
So on paper, he is the absolute king of the castle.
On paper, he has it all. But in reality, behind closed doors, he was completely miserable.
Why was he so unhappy?
Because the company's board of directors was entirely populated by his own relatives. It was all of his aunts, his uncles, his older cousins, and they were a complete disaster as a governing body.
Oh, no. Mixing family dynamics with billion-dollar strategy.
It was constant fighting, endless bickering over minor details. They would literally bring up personal grudges from a Thanksgiving dinner 10 years ago and use them as leverage in a boardroom discussion about corporate strategy.
That is completely dysfunctional.
It was incredibly toxic, and the young CEO felt completely paralyzed by it. Despite his title, whenever he walked into that boardroom, he emotionally regressed. He felt like a little kid who was accidentally allowed to sit at the adults' table.
He was trapped, playing the role of the dutiful nephew, instead of stepping into his actual role as the chief executive officer.
Exactly. He was prioritizing being nice and keeping the peace with his family over being effective for the health of the business. He fundamentally lacked the grounded confidence to assert his own legitimate authority.
So how did he eventually break that destructive cycle?
He had to cognitively and structurally separate the two different worlds. He worked with advisors to create something called a family council.
What does that do?
It was essentially a designated forum just for the emotional family drama and the interpersonal arguments. It was a safe sandbox for the relatives to play in and air their grievances.
Smart. Get it out of the boardroom.
Right. And then he created a completely separate, highly professional board of directors that was strictly dedicated to business strategy.
But he still had to deal with the family.
He did. And that was the hardest part. He had to walk into a room, look his older relatives directly in the eye, and say to them, in this specific room, I am not your nephew. I am the CEO of this company, and these are the professional rules we're going to follow.
That is a genuinely terrifying conversation to have. I mean, that is literally how you get yourself written out of a will.
It takes immense courage, but that is exactly what grounded confidence looks like in action. It is not about screaming or throwing a tantrum. It is about calmly and firmly setting a necessary boundary.
I belong here, and I am in charge here.
Exactly. There is another example in the book that I absolutely love, and it highlights a different angle of this. It involves Lynn Elsenhans. She was a very senior executive at Shell for years, and later she became the CEO of Sunoco.
Oh, this is the coffee story, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have to admit, reading this one made my blood boil just a little bit.
It is infuriating, but it is a classic woman in corporate America moment.
Set the scene for us.
She is sitting in a very high-level, high-stakes strategic meeting. As was often the case back then, she is the only woman in the room. Suddenly, a male colleague, someone who was a peer, not her boss, turns to her in the middle of the meeting and casually asks her to go get him a cup of coffee.
Wow. He just automatically assumed, entirely based on her gender,
Mm.
that her role in that room was to serve him.
It is a massive microaggression, and it creates a pivotal high-pressure moment. The adrenaline spike in a situation like that must be absolutely insane.
Because it feels like you only have two really bad options.
Right. Option one is you can explode. You can yell at him, point out his sexism, and refuse. But if you do that, you get unfairly labeled as emotional or difficult to work with.
Which damages your career. And option two is you just smile, get up and pour the coffee,
Right.
but then you implicitly accept a lower status in the room. You validate his assumption.
It is a complete trap designed to diminish her power. But she found a brilliant third way out. She didn't get visibly angry, but she also absolutely did not submit to his framing.
What did she say?
She looked at him very calmly, with total composure, and she said, "I will do it this time, but next time, it is your turn."
That is just masterful. It is so incredibly subtle, but the weight behind it is immense.
The authors refer to this specific response as self-assurance without aggression.
It diffuses the tension, but holds the line.
She didn't apologize for being in the room. She didn't allow his archaic worldview to define her status. But crucially, she also didn't burn down the professional bridge by starting a screaming match. She simply coolly established her boundary.
That quiet mantra again. I belong here.
That mantra is the ultimate antidote to the imperial CEO's loud, fragile insecurity.
Okay, let us keep moving through the inner journey. Element 3 is selflessness. Now this initially feels like it just pairs directly with humility, but the book treats it as a slightly different muscle.
It is related but distinct. Humility is primarily about your perception of your own status relative to others. Selflessness is entirely about how you view your outcomes and your goals.
How so?
It is the psychological shift from operating with a fixed mindset, where I believe I must always be right in order to prove that I am smart and valuable, to operating with a growth mindset,
Where the goal changes.
where the only goal is to find the absolute best answer for the organization, even if that answer wasn't my idea, or even if it proves my original idea wrong.
They call this specific problem the ego trap.
We see the ego trap play out constantly in both politics and global business. You will see a leader fiercely stick with a failing product launch or a disastrous merger long after it has clearly failed,
Because pulling the plug is painful.
because canceling the project would require a public admission of error. Their identity is so tied to the project that they would literally rather sink the entire corporate ship than admit to the board that they plotted the wrong course.
The book provides a really practical, actionable tool to combat this. It comes from Gonzalo Beach, who is the CEO of BIC, the company that makes the pens and the lighters.
Yes, his famous 6.000 p.m. rule. It is fantastic.
Walk us through how he uses that.
It is a masterclass in decision hygiene. He realized through self-reflection that if he was forced to make highly significant ethical or strategic decisions late at night, he was almost always making them from a place of deep anxiety and fatigue.
The brain is just depleted by that point of the day.
Exactly. But more importantly, when he was tired, his ego took over. He found himself worrying obsessively about how the decision would personally reflect on him. He would lay awake thinking, will the board be mad at me for this? Will the financial press mock me tomorrow morning?
He was completely personalizing the business decision. He was making it about his own survival rather than the company's health.
Right. So to short-circuit that ego trap, he sat down and established a very clear set of 3 ethical and strategic principles for the company. And his ironclad rule is this: all significant needle-moving decisions must be made before dinner time, and they must be made strictly by applying those 3 principles.
It takes the emotion out of it.
It totally depersonalizes the entire process. It stops being a terrifying question of what does Gonzalez want to do and what will people think of him? And it simply becomes, what does our agreed-upon framework dictate we must do?
It removes the exhausted, anxious, self-obsessed ego completely out of the equation.
It protects the company from his own worst instincts.
Okay, that brings us to element 4. And I think this is the one that probably scares people the absolute most, especially the old school command and control crowd. Element 4 is vulnerability.
It terrifies them, and it terrifies them because we have all been heavily socialized, especially men in corporate environments, to view any form of vulnerability as a fatal weakness.
If it bleeds, we can kill it, that mentality.
Exactly. The fear is that if you show a chink in your armor, the corporate sharks will smell blood in the water and circle you. But the authors make a very compelling argument that in today's flat, highly networked, transparent world, vulnerability is actually the only mechanism you have left to build genuine trust.
Because nobody trusts the invulnerable superhero anymore.
If you act like a flawless, emotionless robot, your people might comply with your orders out of fear, but they will never willingly follow you into a fire.
There was a case study in this section about another family business CEO who just could not handle conflict. I found this one really touching because it actually dug deep into his childhood psychology.
Yes, it is a profound example. So this particular CEO was dealing with a highly toxic relative who worked inside the company.
Always a recipe for disaster.
And this relative was actively destroying the corporate culture. He was bullying junior staff, missing targets, just creating chaos. Everyone in the building knew he needed to go, but the CEO simply would not fire him.
He just kept delaying.
He kept making endless excuses. He would say, oh, it is just a bad quarter, or I will talk to him next week.
And from the outside, normally a board would just look at that and say, well, the CEO is just weak. He lacks a spine.
That is the standard corporate diagnosis. But at the Bauer Forum, they really peeled back the psychological layers. They asked him, why are you actually freezing up here? What is the real fear?
And what did he discover?
Through the process, he realized that ever since he was a very young child, his primary survival role within his family system was to be the peacekeeper. That was his entire core identity.
Wow. So his parents fought, and he was the one who smoothed things over?
Exactly. He absorbed the tension to keep the family intact. So, decades later, the idea of explicitly firing a family member of initiating massive conflict felt like a literal violation of his core self.
It wasn't just a business decision. It felt like a psychological death of his identity.
It almost always goes back to that kind of foundational wiring. And this is where the vulnerability piece becomes actionable. He had to be vulnerable enough to finally admit that deep truth to himself and then confess it out loud to his peers at the forum.
He had to name the ghost.
He had to say, I am not holding back on this firing because of some complex business strategy. I'm holding back because I am a terrified little boy who doesn't want to stop being the family peacekeeper.
And just saying it out loud takes away its power.
Once he finally brought that psychological shadow out into the light, he lost his paralyzing fear of it. He was able to separate the past from the present. He flew back to his office and he fired the toxic relative that same week.
That is incredible. The book suggests a really interesting daily tool to help cultivate this kind of self-awareness. They call it the to-be list.
I've actually started using this myself recently, and I will warn you, it is surprisingly difficult to stick with.
How does it differ from a normal list?
Well, we all have to-do lists. Call these 5 shareholders, sign off on the Q3 budget, review the marketing copy. A to-do list tracks tasks, but a to-be list tracks your emotional intention.
Give me some examples.
You literally write down, today I will be curious, or today I will be patient, or today I will be intentionally non-judgmental when someone brings me a problem.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here. That sounds a little bit soft, doesn't it? Writing down, today I will be nice on a Post-it note.
I know it sounds soft when you say it out loud in a vacuum, but it does not feel soft when you are in the middle of a brutal, high-stakes contract negotiation, and you can physically feel your anger and your blood pressure rising because the other side is being unreasonable.
True. That is when the amygdala takes over.
If you haven't set an explicit emotional intention for the day, your amygdala completely hijacks your brain. You explode, you yell, and you probably blow the deal.
But if you primed yourself,
But if you physically wrote down the words, today I will be curious, that morning, your brain actually has a pre-planned cognitive roadmap to pivot towards. You can catch yourself in that tense moment and say, wait, instead of shouting, let me be curious, why are they demanding this specific clause? Let me ask a question.
it is cognitive priming. It creates a circuit breaker for your ego.
Exactly. It keeps you grounded in your vulnerability rather than defaulting to defensive anger.
Okay, element 5 is resilience, but the authors use a very specific phrase here that I really want to highlight. They talk about bouncing forward rather than just bouncing back.
Right. That distinction is everything. Bouncing back implies that after a massive failure, you simply return to the exact same state you were in before the failure occurred. It is a concept of mere restoration.
Like a rubber band snapping back to its original shape.
But bouncing forward means you have actively metabolized the failure. You are now a fundamentally different, wiser, and better entity because of the pain you endured.
In psychology, they call that post-traumatic growth.
Exactly. The exemplar the authors use for this is Anju Patwardhan.
She is a fantastic example of this. Walk us through her career pivot.
She was a highly successful, very senior executive in the traditional banking sector. She had incredibly high status. She had the massive corner office. She had an assistant. When she spoke in a meeting, everyone nodded. When she told a joke, everyone laughed.
She was at the absolute peak of her specific mountain.
But she looked out at the macroeconomic landscape and she realized a terrifying truth. Traditional banking was slowly being eaten alive by the rise of fintech, by venture capital, by crypto.
She saw the asteroid coming.
She saw it coming, and she realized she desperately needed to pivot her career if she wanted to stay relevant for the next decade.
But the problem she faced was that inside her specific bank, she was a reigning queen. But outside, in places like Silicon Valley, she was essentially a nobody.
She admitted she had zero external network in the tech world. None. So she had to make a brutal choice. She could either stay inside the bank where she was universally worshipped but slowly become obsolete, or she could walk into a new world where she was completely ignored and actually learn how to survive.
She chose the harder path.
She chose the latter. She literally started going to entry-level tech meetups and networking events. Imagine this senior banking executive walking into a room full of 25-year-old startup founders in hoodies who have absolutely no idea who she is.
And she had to basically start from scratch and ask questions.
She had to ask what she herself called stupid questions. She would sit down and say, "Excuse me, what exactly is an API? How does this specific blockchain protocol actually work?"
That is a massive, incredibly painful ego check for someone who is so used to being the ultimate expert in the room.
But that is what true resilience looks like. It is the ability to actively reframe the pain and embarrassment of your own ignorance. You stop seeing it as a personal flaw, and you start seeing it simply as the mandatory cost of admission for future growth.
If you aren't willing to look stupid for a little while, you cannot possibly learn anything new.
And the reality is, in the modern economy, if you cannot continuously learn, you are dead in the water.
Which leads us perfectly into the final element of the inner journey: versatility.
Or agility. It is the ability to constantly shapeshift depending on the context.
The ultimate hero of this section is Ed Bastian, the CEO of Delta Airlines. I really cannot imagine a worse, more terrifying job in the world in March of 2020 than trying to run a global airline.
It was apocalyptic. Delta's revenue dropped something like 95% essentially overnight. Thousands of planes were just parked on runways doing nothing.
But as the book points out, worse than the financial hemorrhage was the absolute information vacuum.
Nobody knew anything. Do cloth masks actually work on a plane? Is the virus transmitted on plastic tray tables? Is it purely airborne? Can we legally or safely fly our crew anywhere?
Total ambiguity. And the old imperial CEO archetype would have hated that ambiguity. They would have felt compelled to pretend they knew the answer. They would have stood up at a podium, pounded their fist, and said, "Here is the definitive plan. Follow me."
And they would have been disastrously wrong. And when you are confidently wrong in a literal life or death crisis, you lose the trust of your employees and your customers forever.
So what did Bastian do differently?
Bastian did something genuinely radical for a Fortune 500 CEO. He went on television and to his employees, and he flatly said, "I do not know."
He admitted his own ignorance.
He admitted he was an airline executive, not an infectious disease expert. So instead of guessing, he partnered directly with the Mayo Clinic. He actually went out and hired a chief health officer to join the executive suite of the airline.
He fundamentally shifted his posture from being a knower to being a learner.
Exactly. And this introduces a really crucial framework from the book called the 5 Balancing Acts.
Go to those.
It is the idea that a versatile, modern leader has to be able to hold two completely opposing ideas in their mind and enact both simultaneously without losing their balance.
Give me an example of that tension.
So you have to be deeply humble, meaning you admit you don't know the virus science, but you also have to be fiercely decisive, meaning you still have to act on the best available imperfect data to ground the global fleet today.
You can't let humility become paralysis.
Right. And you have to be highly vulnerable. You show your employees that you genuinely care about their deep fear of getting sick, but you also must remain incredibly soft. Strong meaning you still have to make the brutal, emotionless financial cuts required to ensure the company doesn't go bankrupt by Friday.
It is not a choice between being soft or hard. It is the requirement to be both, dynamically, depending on the exact minute of the day.
That is true versatility.
Okay, I feel like we all need to take a deep breath here. That is a massive amount of psychological heavy lifting. That is the entire inner journey. We have stripped down the defensive ego. We have built up a quiet, grounded confidence. We have practiced painful vulnerability, and we have learned how to be cognitively agile.
We are fundamentally psychologically ready to lead.
But now, we have to turn all of that internal work outward. We are moving to part 2, the outer journey. How do you actually take this newly evolved self and project it onto a massive organization to drive real results?
This is where the theoretical rubber finally meets the operational road. Because the truth is, you can be a perfectly enlightened Zen master in the privacy of your own office, but if you cannot actively mobilize 10,000 distracted, anxious people to execute a complex global strategy, you are not actually a leader. You are just a philosopher.
Fair point. Element 7 starts the outer journey with a mandate. Embed purpose. And I have to say, I feel like purpose is easily the most abused, hollowed-out word in corporate America today.
It is entirely a buzzword now.
Right. Every single company on Earth has a framed mission statement in their lobby that absolutely nobody reads or cares about. It always says something generic like, we exist to maximize shareholder value while leveraging cross-functional synergies to delight our customers.
It is corporate wallpaper. It means literally nothing to the person actually doing the work.
So how do you make it real?
The authors argue that you cannot simply command people to care. You cannot mandate purpose from the top down. You have to actively connect the employee's personal individual why to the organization's overarching why.
The story of Claire Babineau-Fontenot at Feeding America is the absolute gold standard for this, isn't it?
It really is. And to understand her leadership, you have to understand her personal backstory.
She's a cancer survivor, right?
She is. She battled severe cancer and survived. And as anyone who has ever faced their own immediate mortality knows, it fundamentally rewires your brain. It forces you to ask the biggest possible question. Why am I still here? What is the actual point of my remaining time?
She didn't want to just go back to climbing a corporate ladder to make more money.
She wanted a visceral mission. So she took over as the CEO of Feeding America, which is a massive hunger relief organization. And then almost immediately after she took the helm, the COVID pandemic hit.
And suddenly, Feeding America wasn't just a charity. It became critical, life-saving infrastructure for millions of people who lost their jobs overnight.
But you have to remember the terrifying context of those early months. There were no vaccines, there were barely any masks available, there was mass public panic.
Right.
And showing up to work at a physical food bank meant standing in a poorly ventilated warehouse with hundreds of strangers every single day.
You were literally risking your own life and potentially your family's life just by going to work.
Exactly. So the obvious question is, how did she keep her workforce from just completely collapsing? Why didn't everyone just quit and stay home where it was safe?
It wasn't because of the paycheck?
It certainly wasn't the pay. It was because she didn't focus on managing the logistics of the food delivery. She focused entirely on managing the meaning of the work.
How did she do that?
She constantly, relentlessly reinforced the reality that their specific daily labor was the literal difference between life and death for their own neighbors. She shared specific stories of families they were saving. She made the abstract concept of hunger intensely locally personal.
She embedded the purpose into the daily grind.
That when an individual employee deeply feels that their specific existence matters, that if they specifically do not show up to the warehouse today, a real child in their own zip code will actually go to bed hungry tonight, they will endure almost any hardship to get the job done.
It completely transforms the daily labor from being just a job to being a profound calling.
Exactly. And the book points out that you can do this even in traditional for-profit companies. It isn't just for charities. Look at the case of Rodney O'Neill at Delphi.
Delphi was an auto parts manufacturer.
Yes, and they were facing imminent catastrophic bankruptcy. Now, it is incredibly hard to inspire purpose in a factory when every single worker is terrified that their pension is going to evaporate by next month.
So what was his pitch to the floor? Was it just, hey, work harder so we can appease our creditors and save the stock price?
No, because nobody on an assembly line cares about a Wall Street creditor. That never works. Instead, he rallied the entire workforce around the concepts of legacy and dignity.
He appealed to their pride.
He essentially stood up and said, we are historically great at what we do. We build great products. We are absolutely not going to be the specific generation that lets this proud industrial legacy die on our watch. We are going to fight for our professional reputation and our dignity.
He made it about who they were, not the financial math.
He made it a matter of honor. That is leading with the heart, not just reading off a spreadsheet.
Let us move to Element 8, Inspire Boldness. This is fundamentally a chapter about how organizations handle risk.
It is about consciously taking fear out of the driver's seat of the corporate car. The prime exemplar here is Stefan Bancel, the CEO of Moderna.
Now, obviously, we all know the triumphant end of this specific story. They successfully created the COVID vaccine and changed history. But the beginning of that story was absolutely terrifying for the company.
It was the ultimate bet the company moment. People forget that before COVID, Moderna was essentially just a high-end research shop. They had never actually brought a single commercial product to market, not one.
They were entirely theoretical.
Right. But when the virus genome was first published online, Bansal looked at his team and he essentially said, we are going to pivot everything. We're going to produce this vaccine and we're going to do it faster than any pharmaceutical company in human history.
And the outside critics absolutely crucified him for it at the time. They called him totally reckless. They accused him of just hyping the stock price to cash out.
They did. But the authors make a really critical distinction here between gambling and boldness.
What is the difference in this context?
Gambling is just closing your eyes, throwing money on the roulette table, and relying on blind luck. Boldness, however, is a deep intuition that is firmly backed by years of rigorous, specialized expertise.
Bansal wasn't guessing.
Bansal knew the underlying mRNA science significantly better than the Wall Street analysts who were criticizing him. He knew that if his team treated the vaccine development process more like writing software, code rapidly iterating sequences on a computer rather than slowly growing biological cultures in a physical petri dish, they could actually achieve the impossible timeline.
He trusted his gut, but only because his gut was highly educated by years of data.
Exactly. Boldness requires a foundation of extreme competence.
There is another example of boldness in the book that I think is arguably even harder to execute because it is primarily cultural rather than scientific. I'm thinking of Makoto Uchida at Nissan.
The town hall story. This is a brilliant example of cultural boldness. So set the stage. Nissan is in a massive existential crisis. The previous legendary CEO had been literally arrested. The company's financials are bleeding out.
Morale is completely in the toilet.
And Uchida suddenly takes over to try and stop the bleeding. Now, you have to remember that Nissan is a very traditional, deeply hierarchical Japanese corporation. Protocol and face are everything.
Right.
Traditionally, a CEO town hall meeting in that culture is highly choreographed, scripted theater. The communications team selects 5 safe, pre-screened questions. The CEO reads 5 carefully pre-written answers off a teleprompter. There is polite applause, and everyone goes back to their desks.
But Uchida completely threw out that script.
He walked out onto the stage in front of thousands of anxious employees, and he just opened the live microphone. No script, no pre-screened questions. He stood there and took completely live, unvetted, highly emotional questions from an angry, scared workforce.
That is a high-wire act without a safety net. If he says the wrong thing, it is front-page news in Tokyo the next morning.
It takes immense courage. He just stood there and absorbed the heat. And crucially, when an employee asked him a complex question that he didn't have the answer for, he didn't lie or deflect. He just admitted it.
Going back to vulnerability.
Yes, he said, I do not know the answer to that yet, but I am hearing your pain. I am human, just like you. Let us fix this broken company together.
That vulnerability we talked about in the inner journey actually became the structural fuel for his outer boldness.
By publicly breaking that rigid corporate script, he signaled to the entire global workforce that the old, secretive, defensive culture of Nissan was officially dead. It was a new day, and truth was now acceptable.
Which leads perfectly into element 9, empower people. The subtitle the authors use for this section is Control is an Illusion.
This is undoubtedly the hardest lesson for any successful micromanager to internalize. Because think about how you actually climb the corporate ladder in the early days. You get promoted early in your career specifically by being in absolute meticulous control of the details.
You check the spreadsheet cell by cell. You rewrite the junior associate's memo to make it perfect. You fix all the errors yourself.
Exactly. You are rewarded for control. But once you finally reach the C-suite, the actual scope of the operation becomes astronomically too big. You physically cannot check the math on a global supply chain.
If you even try to check the math, you freeze the company.
You become the ultimate bottleneck. The book uses the analogy of an orchestra conductor. Now, I know it sounds a bit cliche, but Rob Painter, the CEO of Trimble, uses it incredibly effectively.
It is a cliche because it is an accurate model of leadership.
Right. Painter tells his team, look, I cannot play the violin better than my first chair violinist. I absolutely cannot play the oboe. I cannot write the core software code. And I cannot close a complex enterprise sales deal better than my top reps.
So what is his actual job?
He says, my job isn't to make the music myself. My job is solely to ensure that the tempo of the organization is right, that the volume between the different departments is balanced, and most importantly, that everyone is actually playing the exact same song from the same sheet music.
But the immediate fear for a leader is quality control. If I let go of the steering wheel, my team is going to drive the car into a ditch. How do you let go without courting disaster?
Frank D'Souza, who managed explosive growth at Cognizant, developed a framework he calls safe but accountable.
How does that work in practice?
It is a two-part equation. First, you have to hire people who are genuinely smarter and more specialized than you are in their specific domains. You give them a very wide, autonomous lane to operate in.
But there's a catch.
The catch is that you pair that massive autonomy with incredibly rigorous, unyielding performance metrics. It is absolutely not a free-for-all where people can do whatever they want.
It is freedom within a very strict framework.
The message is, here is the overarching goal we must hit. You are the expert, so you figure out the daily tactical path to get us there. I will not tell you how to do your job, but we will strictly measure the final arrival.
You firmly control the what and the why, but you completely surrender control of the how.
Exactly. That is how you scale empowerment without losing control of the company's destiny.
Let us move to element 10. Encourage truth-telling. Because, let us be completely real here, almost everyone lies to the boss.
They absolutely do. It is called the CEO bubble, and it is entirely driven by a basic human survival instinct.
Self-preservation.
Right. If you tell the powerful boss bad news, you run the very real risk of being shot as the messenger. So negative data naturally gets filtered as it moves up the chain of command.
The junior manager sees a crisis, but tells the director it is a challenge.
And the director tells the VP it is a minor hiccup. And by the time the data finally reaches the CEO's desk, a 5-alarm operational fire has been papered over to look like a completely managed situation.
The authors use a fascinating historical A/B test to illustrate the extreme danger of this bubble. They compare John F. Kennedy's handling of the Bay of Pigs invasion to his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
It is the perfect illustration of learning how to manage the truth. In the Bay of Pigs scenario, JFK is a brand new, highly glamorous president. All of his senior advisors desperately want to please him and look competent.
They want to stay in his inner circle.
So the CIA presents this deeply flawed, terrible tactical plan to secretly invade Cuba. And almost everyone in the room has private, serious doubts about the math. But absolutely nobody wants to be the negative buzzkill who ruins the meeting. Nobody wants to contradict the CIA director in front of the president.
So everyone just stays silent and nods along.
And they greenlight the mission,
Yeah.
and it turns into a massive, humiliating global disaster for the administration.
So how did he change his process for the missile crisis?
Well, JFK learned a brutal lesson about the danger of a polite room. And during the missile crisis, the stakes were literally global thermonuclear war. He could not afford yes men.
What did he do differently?
He explicitly appointed his brother, Bobby Kennedy, and a few others to actively play the role of devil's advocate in every single meeting. He gave them a direct mandate. Do not be polite. Your job is to aggressively tear this military plan apart. Find every single logical flaw and expose it to me.
He structurally institutionalized fierce dissent.
Yes. And because they passionately debated the ugly truth, instead of hiding behind polite consensus, they were able to find a creative diplomatic solution and actively avoid World War III.
Translating that to the corporate world, the modern hero of this truth-telling element has to be Alan Mulally during his turnaround of Ford Motor Company.
The famous story of the red and green charts. This is legendary in management circles.
Tell the story.
When Mulally first took over Ford, the company was financially bleeding to death. They were losing billions of dollars. The entire enterprise was essentially on fire. But every single week at the mandatory executive committee meeting, his senior team would dutifully show him these PowerPoint charts that were all color-coded green.
Meaning everything is perfectly on track.
Right.
Which is just institutional delusion. The building is burning to the ground and everyone in the room is smiling and saying this is fine.
Mulally finally just stopped the meeting one day. He looked at his executives and he said, "Guys, we are literally losing billions of dollars as a corporation. Is there truly absolutely nothing going wrong in any of your departments?"
The room must have been terrified.
They were paralyzed. They all assumed it was a trap. They thought the first person to admit a failure was going to be publicly fired on the spot.
But finally, someone broke the silence.
Finally, an executive named Mark Fields, who later actually became the CEO himself, put up a slide with a giant red mark on it. It detailed a severe production delay with the tailgate on a major new vehicle launch.
The oxygen must have just completely left the room at that moment, everyone waiting for the execution.
But instead of yelling, Mulally started clapping. He literally applauded Mark Fields in front of the entire executive suite.
Wow.
He looked at him and said, "Mark, thank you so much for that clear visibility. Now we can finally deploy the resources to help you fix it."
That is the ultimate signal to the culture.
That single moment of applause completely changed the trajectory of Ford. He definitively proved to his team that telling the ugly truth was not just safe, it was actively rewarded.
If you punish the messenger, you will eventually fly blind.
Exactly. If people are afraid of you, they will lie to you. And if they lie to you, you will not have the accurate data you need to survive the market.
Element 11 is closely related to this. It is adopt fearless learning. This is where the book brings in the Navy SEALs.
Yes. Admiral Eric Olson, he provides a masterclass in how to process failure in real time. He breaks down the psychology of the famous raid on Osama bin Laden's compound.
Now, everyone in the public thinks of that specific mission as an absolute triumph of flawless military precision. But operationally, in the very first minute, it started as a total disaster.
It was a nightmare scenario. One of the highly modified stealth helicopters literally lost lift and crashed violently into the wall of the compound during the initial insertion.
Just imagine the sheer pressure of that exact moment. You have planned this mission for years. The President of the United States is watching you on a live drone feed in the Situation Room, and your primary helicopter is suddenly a burning wreck in the courtyard of the target.
In any normal corporate organization, absolute panic immediately sets in. The original plan is visibly broken, everyone freezes. Game over.
But the SEAL operators obviously didn't freeze.
They didn't even blink. They systematically blew up the wreckage of the crashed chopper so the tech wouldn't be stolen. They seamlessly switched over to Plan B, they breached the compound, and they executed the rest of the mission flawlessly.
How is that humanly possible? How do you train a human brain to remain that incredibly calm when a literal helicopter is on fire 10 feet away from you?
Admiral Olson breaks it down into what he calls the Big Four techniques for extreme panic management. And what is brilliant is that this is highly actionable for anyone listening to us right now who deals with high stress in their own job.
Okay, let us go through the big four step by step. What is number one?
Number one is goal setting. But it is a very specific type of goal setting.
Yeah.
It is not focusing on the macro goal like, I need to win this war. It is intensely micro goals.
Why, Mike?
Because if your brain tries to process the entire massive disaster all at once, your nervous system gets overwhelmed and simply shuts down. You freeze. So you actively shrink your world down to the next 3 seconds.
Give me an example.
My only goal right now is to unbuckle my seatbelt. Done. My next goal is to physically check my weapon. Done. My next goal is to radio my squad mate. Done. You focus entirely on executing just the immediate next step, ignoring the larger chaos.
Okay, that makes sense. Focus on the micro. What is number two?
Number two is mental rehearsal. Visualization. The SEALs didn't just practice the perfect raid. They had spent months mentally and physically visualizing catastrophic failure. They had literally flown the simulation and intentionally crashed the helicopter in the simulation 100 times.
So when the actual crash happened in real life?
When it happened for real in Pakistan, their brains didn't register it as a novel, terrifying shock. Their brains registered it as a deeply familiar operational scenario. The internal monologue is just, oh, we crashed the chopper. Okay, I already know exactly what protocol to run when we crash the chopper.
The fear of the unknown is removed because it is no longer unknown. What is number three?
Number three is self-talk. We all constantly talk to ourselves internally. In a sudden panic situation, your default internal voice is usually screaming, "We are going to die. This is a total disaster. I am going to lose my job."
The catastrophizing voice.
Exactly. You have to learn how to actively override that panicked voice with a very calm, highly instructional voice. You literally have to coach yourself in real time. You tell yourself, stabilize your stance, look at the exit, communicate with the team. You replace panic with instruction.
And what is the final one, number four?
Number four is the most physiological. It is breath control. It is literally managing your respiration to physically slow down your soaring heart rate. The SEALs use a technique called box breathing.
How does slowing your breathing help your brain in a crisis?
When you are panicking, your heart races and your amygdala takes over, shutting down your prefrontal cortex, which is the logical problem-solving part of your brain. By deliberately controlling your breath, you force your physiology to calm down, which physically keeps your prefrontal cortex online so you can continue to think rationally.
And the authors argue that business teams need to adopt this kind of fearless learning.
Yes, they suggest running constant premortems. Before you launch a major new product, sit the team down and say, okay, Let us imagine it is 6 months from now, and this launch was a total catastrophic failure. Why did it fail?
You visualize the crash before you take off.
Exactly. You slice the project apart like an MRI scan to find the hidden failure points. So when a PR crisis eventually does happen, you don't panic, you just calmly execute the backup plan you already wrote.
This is such a dense, incredible toolkit.
Mm.
We are finally at the very last element, element 12. Instill empathy.
This perfectly brings the entire journey full circle, right back to our shared humanity.
The central figure here is Bob Chapman. He is the CEO of a massive manufacturing company called Barry Wimmeler, and his entire operational philosophy is called truly human leadership.
He essentially operates on a single core belief that sounds completely radical coming from the mouth of an industrial CEO. He says, every single employee in my company is someone else's precious child.
I'm going to be honest, when I first read that line in the book, it sounded incredibly sentimental. It sounded very soft for a heavy manufacturing company.
I think a lot of Wall Street analysts would initially agree with you. It sounds like a greeting card. But Chapman fundamentally proved that this philosophy actually drives superior resilience in the hardest possible economic conditions.
You were talking about the 2008 financial crisis.
Exactly. The ultimate stress test. During the massive 2008 crash, Barry Wimmeler's incoming equipment orders completely evaporated. Their revenue dropped 30% almost overnight.
It was a bloodbath for the whole sector.
The board of directors looked at the cold financial math, and they told Chapman the obvious. You have to execute massive layoffs immediately to save cash. It is the only mathematical way to survive.
That is the standard corporate playbook. You cut 10% of the headcount to save the balance sheet.
Chapman flatly refused to do it. He told the board, we absolutely do not fire family members when times get tough. A healthy family does not kick 3 of the kids out of the house just because the parents took a pay cut.
But he still had a massive budget shortfall. He couldn't just print money. So what was his actual alternative to layoffs?
He engineered a brilliant program of shared sacrifice. He implemented a mandatory furlough program across the entire company. Every single person, from the CEO down to the newest janitor on the factory floor, had to take 4 weeks of completely unpaid leave.
So everyone took a financial hit.
Everyone. He stood up in front of the company, he transparently explained the brutal financial math, and he said, it is profoundly better that every single one of us should suffer just a little bit than that a few of us should have to suffer a massive, life-destroying amount.
And what was the actual reaction from the workforce?
Yeah.
Because losing 4 weeks of pay is a huge deal for a line worker.
The reaction was absolutely extraordinary. Because the culture was already built on deep empathy, the employees began actively managing the pain themselves. People who were more financially secure, maybe they had savings or their spouse had a very secure, high-paying job, they actually voluntarily traded their paid weeks with employees who were living paycheck to paycheck.
They protected each other.
They did. An older worker would go to a younger worker who just had a baby and say, I will take your unpaid week off so you can keep your full paycheck.
That brings tears to your eyes.
The internal morale and loyalty skyrocketed during the worst economic crisis of our lifetime. They successfully saved the money they needed to survive the crash. But far more importantly, they entirely preserved the soul and the deep trust of the company.
And the book draws a very sharp contrast here with another CEO, right? A cautionary tale.
It is a devastating contrast. They discuss another CEO who had personally donated $120 million of his own wealth to establish a massive educational scholarship fund.
Which is obviously a very generous philanthropic act on the surface.
And he publicly called that donation his proudest moment in life. He desperately wanted to be seen as a great, benevolent hero to the world. But meanwhile, inside his actual company, his own employees were quitting in absolute droves.
Why were they leaving?
Because the internal corporate culture he had built was incredibly toxic, the stress was unbearable, and the baseline pay was terrible. When confronted with this massive turnover, the CEO was genuinely baffled. He literally asked his HR department, I pay them a salary, why are they quitting?
He honestly couldn't comprehend it.
He couldn't connect the dots at all. He fundamentally lacked internal empathy. He viewed his own employees merely as disposable units of economic production, not as complex human beings with their own struggles and stories. And because he treated them like machines, the culture collapsed and he ultimately failed as a leader.
We have honestly covered a truly massive amount of psychological and strategic ground today. Just recapping the 12 elements. First, the inner journey. You need humility, grounded confidence, selflessness, vulnerability, resilience, and versatility.
Right.
And then the outer journey. You project purpose, inspire boldness, empower your people, encourage hard truth-telling, adopt fearless learning, and finally, instill empathy.
It is literally a complete operating system rewrite for the modern executive.
It really is.
Yeah.
And frankly, as a listener sitting here absorbing all of this, it feels incredibly overwhelming. If I am listening to this on my commute, I'm probably thinking I cannot possibly implement all 12 of these massive paradigm shifts by Monday morning. I cannot magically transform into a Navy SEAL and a Zen monk and an empathetic therapist all at the exact same time.
And you absolutely should not try to do that. If you try to change everything by Monday, you will achieve nothing. The authors are very practical about this. They conclude the entire book with what they call a commitment plan.
Okay, bring us down to earth.
It is entirely about recognizing that this is a lifelong, iterative journey. You have to treat your own ongoing psychological leadership development with the exact same level of rigorous seriousness that you treat your annual corporate strategy development. You pick one or two highly specific micro practices to start with.
Give us the Monday morning list. What are 3 small, concrete things a listener can actually do tomorrow to start this journey?
Okay, let us break it down. For yourself, regarding the inner journey, try writing the to-be list. Just commit to it for one single week. Tomorrow morning, before you open a single email, before you look at Slack, write down on a physical piece of paper exactly how you want to be that day.
Today I will be calm. Today I will be listening.
Exactly. And just observe if it organically changes your emotional reactions during your afternoon meetings.
Okay, that is for the self. What about a micro practice for the team?
For the team, start implementing the true check-in. When you begin your next team meeting, do not just immediately dive into the financial spreadsheet. Look at your people and ask, how are you doing, really?
And then actually stop talking and wait for the real answer.
Right. Dedicate the first 20% of the meeting strictly to human connection. Build the relational trust before you demand the operational output. It only takes 5 minutes, but the dividends it pays in loyalty and psychological safety are massive.
And finally, what is a micro practice for the broader organization?
Find your own Alan Mulally moment. Reward the ugly truth. The very next time a junior employee or a colleague tells you something that actively hurts your ego but genuinely helps the company, if they are the one brave enough to point out the red mark on the otherwise green chart, do not get defensive.
Clap for them.
Literally or metaphorically, applaud them in front of others. Make it visibly, undeniably safe for people to tell you the hard truth.
Clap for the hard truth. That is absolutely the big sticky takeaway for me today.
The ultimate lesson of the Bauer Forum and this entire book is that external leadership is fundamentally an internal, inside job.
You cannot fake it.
You can't. If you truly want to change the ultimate trajectory of your entire company or the culture of your small team or even the dynamic of your own family, you absolutely have to find the courage to look deeply in the mirror first. You have to fix the buggy software running inside your own head before you try to reprogram anyone else.
The journey of leadership. It is undeniably a very heavy psychological lift, but based on everything we have covered today, it sounds like it is the only viable path forward in this chaotic new world. Thank you so much for walking us through all of this in such incredible detail.
It was entirely my pleasure. It is a vital conversation to have.
And everyone out there listening right now, go get a piece of paper and write down that to-be list for tomorrow. We will see you on the next deep dive.